Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is the relationship between the FiveFactor model of personality theory and sexual behavior? Now, to help answer this question about sexual behavior and the FiveFactor model, I'm going to be using an article that was published in 2018 by Allen and Walter, and I'll put the reference to this article in the description to this video. This particular study was a meta-analysis, and here they looked at 137 articles that were written on this topic or similar topics, and took that information and looked at it all together. So they performed an analysis of many studies. So I'm going to start with the FiveFactor model, look at some of the constructs of sexual behavior, and then talk about the relationship between the two. So when we talk about the FiveFactor model of personality theory, we're talking about 5 big personality traits. I usually remember these traits through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And each of the big traits has several characteristics that are associated with it. So with openness to experience, we see characteristics like creativity, appreciating the arts, experiencing emotions intensely, being intellectually curious, and adventurous. With conscientiousness, we see achievement striving, somebody who's cautious, competent, someone who follows rules, and we also see hardworking and responsible behavior. With extraversion, we see traits like being gregarious, being friendly. Extraversion is also associated with positive emotions, which is different than lack of negative emotions. We also see excitement seeking, being assertive, and being talkative. With agreeableness, we see trust, cooperation, modesty, being altruistic, being sympathetic, good-natured, and compliant. Now with neuroticism, we see traits like being anxious, depressed, hostile, feeling vulnerable. We also see impulsiveness here and the tendency to experience negative emotions in general. So with that extraversion trait, we saw experiencing positive emotions. With neuroticism, we see the trait of experiencing negative emotions. Now it's important to note here, if we look at the FiveFactor model and compare it to some of the traits we think might be related to sexual behavior, impulsivity stands out as one characteristic that might have a relationship. And impulsivity is really measured on 2 of the traits. With neuroticism, of course, we see impulsiveness, which I just mentioned, and this is an impulsiveness that's associated with not resisting temptation easily. And with conscientiousness, we see impulsiveness as the opposite of cautiousness. So if somebody has low conscientiousness, they could have more impulsivity. And this is more related to rushing into things. So 2 aspects of impulsiveness captured on 2 different traits. Now we know the FiveFactor model can predict outcomes in a variety of domains, like mental health, work and school success, chronic illness, and mortality, for example. So it wouldn't be surprising if the FiveFactor model can predict certain sexual behaviors. Also with the FiveFactor model, we see that the socially desirable profile would be high openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, and agreeableness, and low neuroticism. Although, as I discussed in a prior video, the socially desirable directionality of these traits isn't always positive. There's negatives and positives associated with both low and high scores on each of the traits. So now moving to the relationship between the FiveFactor model of personality theory and sexual behavior. When we look at this study, it's important to recognize that they looked at a lot of different aspects of sexuality, not just sexual behavior. Here I'll just be looking at a few of the domains they covered, including sexual activity, sexual infidelity, hypersexual behavior, and risky sexual behavior. So I'll start with sexual activity. Now this is defined in a number of ways. We see the frequency of sexual intercourse as one way. Another way is the number of lifetime partners. The average for men is 14 partners. The average for women is 7. This study broke down these elements separately. So for the frequency of sexual intercourse, we see this is associated with extraversion positively. So higher sexual activity, higher frequency is associated with higher extraversion. And this includes casual and non-committed sex. We also see that sexual activity has a negative relationship with conscientiousness and agreeableness. So a higher level of sexual activity is associated with lower conscientiousness and lower agreeableness, and this is particularly true for the casual sex construct. A higher number of sexual partners over the lifetime was associated with higher extroversion and higher openness to experience, but it was not associated with agreeableness or neuroticism. This association was found in other studies, but not here. The next construct is sexual infidelity, and we know that in any given year, about 2 to 4% of spouses will engage in sexual infidelity, and about 15 to 25% of all marriages will be affected by sexual infidelity. And this figure is really a bit conservative, as noted in this study. In this study, we see a negative relationship between sexual infidelity and conscientiousness and agreeableness. So low conscientiousness and low agreeableness was associated with more sexual infidelity, as was more extroversion. So there's a positive association between extroversion and sexual infidelity, although this positive correlation was relatively small. Now, there was no relationship found with neuroticism and sexual infidelity overall, but for older individuals, a higher level of neuroticism was associated with more sexual infidelity. Now, in terms of hypersexual behavior, this is where somebody has an increased focus or interest in sex. This is also called sexual compulsivity. This was associated with higher levels of neuroticism and lower levels of agreeableness. The last sexual behavior I'll cover here is risky sexual behavior, and this had a positive association with extroversion. That was the most strongly related personality trait to risky sexual behavior. We also saw a negative relationship with conscientiousness and agreeableness. So more risky sexual behavior was associated with low conscientiousness and low agreeableness. So how can we apply the findings from this study? Personality theory, as it relates to a variety of different topics, including sexual behavior, is fairly interesting, but can we do anything with this information? And the answer is yes. We can see here that this can help us identify individuals who may realize the greatest benefit from sexual health interventions, and it also helps clients to understand how their personality traits may be connected to sexual behavior, how those traits could contribute to certain sexual behaviors. I hope you found this description of the FiveFactor model and sexual behavior to be interesting. Thanks for watching.